Hey Josh, look what someone just posted on your wall. It's a meme. It says, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the Republican platform is, look at how terrible America is. Vote for 4 more years of this.
That's not as bad as what I'm seeing on yours that says how to fix America. We got to put Jesus back in all the places we asked him to leave, right? Home, school, government, church, and your heart, you sinner.
Oh man. Hansel here with you guys, and this is my co-host Josh. With so much happening right now with Christians and government, everybody has an opinion about something. We want to take you guys into that conversation today and show you the two different perspectives and how people arrive at those two different perspectives. So usually with the conversation of Christians and government or Christians and politics, we have this pair or this dichotomy, if you will. You have the law of the land, which is the government law, and you have the law of God. And the question is, how do those interact? Right. So Josh, usually people have 3 basic fundamental blocks that they have to work with, and it's these. 1, according to Romans 13, if the law of the land coincides with the moral law or the law of God, then you should obey both. Mm-hmm. You should do your best to live in peace and to respect your authorities, okay? Number 2, when the law of the land is blatantly opposing the law of God or the moral law, then you prioritize the law of God. And we see examples of these with the apostles. In the book of Acts, for example, the government is telling the apostles basically, hey, stop spreading this Christian propaganda. It's not good for the government. And they said, no, we need to submit to God rather than submit to man. But here's where things get tricky. When the law of the land maybe opposes the law of God, how do we know? Wisdom and discernment then are necessary for charity and love and for Christian growth, for love of God and love of neighbor. And so what we're going to do today is examine 3 specific cases that we have in our modern day context and how Christians, first of all, disagree on their perspective, right, but how they get there. So take us through the first one. Yeah, so as we jump under the hood, we're talking about these 3 things that we know people get mad at, right? And we know that good conversations are difficult to have with each other. And the first one that we're talking about is illegal immigration specifically. And the reason we want to touch on this is because it's important to remember that there's a clear violation of some law happening here, but we have to determine, is the violation of that law worse than, equal to, or better than, right, the violation of the law of God or whatever that is. And so when we talk about the mission of the church on earth, some people talk about like the idea here is earth is obviously not just America, right? And so as people who are citizens of the kingdom of heaven, we ask ourselves the question, who is my neighbor? Right? Who is the person that I'm called to love? And from an image of God perspective, the idea is love of neighbor clearly extends beyond borders. And we see all types of different examples of this that occur between God and his conversation specifically with Israel about how they're supposed to treat the foreigner, people who are not from their nation. And so the heavenly citizenship has implications over how we fulfill our responsibilities on earth. And this especially becomes true when you look at the stats that kind of bore this out, right? In the United States, roughly 1 in 10 evangelicals in 2007 were evangelicals who were immigrants themselves or their children were immigrants. And by 2014, that number had risen as high as 16%. So clearly, right, we're several years later, so that number's probably higher now. So the reality becomes we're looking at an issue or a conversation where it's like 1 in 5 immigrants is our brother. Yeah. Who clearly claims the same, even not just like they're Anglican or they're Catholic or they're Baptist or like pretend Christian or whatever. Like these are people that are within the biggest strand of Christianity in America, in evangelicalism. And so it's like out of that 1 out of 5, certainly out of that 20%-ish, some of those people are not going to be legal residents. So what do we do with that, right? Like isn't our purpose to love them even though, you know, they're not necessarily supposed to be part of the discussion here? Yeah, that is super interesting. I didn't know that stat before today. Like, think about that. 1 in 5 people. Yeah, it's huge. That is generally an evangelical is likely an illegal immigrant. Well, to be an immigrant, right, or a child of an immigrant. Gotcha. So, and out of that population, some of those people will that's huge. So think about that, right? So if you have 100 people in your church, that's 20 people probably who are having some affiliation. If you have 200 people in your church, that's 40 persons. That's crazy. So the way I think about this, and I think that the way the perspectives are going to change on this issue, or the disagreement lies, is how you view your duty to your neighbor, which is what you said, right? So I've heard it said that duty to your neighbor or responsibility can be seen as concentric circles. So Josh, you have a wife and you have a daughter, right? I'm willing to guess you probably feel more of a duty to them than you would to me, for example.
Sure, naturally.
Okay, so in the tightest core of that concentric circle is your nuclear family, your main responsibility.
Right.
Then probably people outside of that might be your immediate family. And if we kept going out, you might have your friends or church members. So it's really interesting to see that the way you prioritize or label the layers in that concentric circle, on whatever side you lie of this issue or perspective, those are going to be somewhat ordered or prioritized a little different. Because on the other hand, right, the other perspective is, well, we can, given that love of neighbor and love of God is supremely important, it's the sum of all the law, right?
Right, yeah.
Given that, in the real world, you need order, you need borders to be able to steward the resources that God gave us to actually take care of the people we have here. So I've also heard it said, well, hold on, are you then suggesting that love of God suggests or means that to love one people group means I cannot love others if we cannot provide sufficient resources for Americans?
Right.
Whether that be, I don't know, veterans or people who need jobs or housing or all sorts of like complex economic and social issues. Are we then suggesting, this perspective would ask, that to love a specific group means I have to not love another group?
Right.
And what's interesting about that is you still have a concentric circle of responsibility, you just ordered it differently. Because that person might say, well, my primary duty then would be to my American citizen, who is my neighbor, and to my church member and my family, etc. And somewhere out there is also a duty to the alien or the foreigner who's coming in, but not as close. And so, what do you think? What do you think are some of the dividing lines here of how people choose to order these? Is it arbitrary, or how do we get there?
I think there's always going to be some cultural inculcation that happens here in some type of discussion, particularly around rhetoric, right? And in the church's response, we have a propensity to take one of two lines of discussion, and one of them kind of centers around like heavenly citizenship, being in the world, not of the world, so not making some type of prioritization based on somebody who either looks like me, right? Like there's a specific directive to act against tribalism, meaning like I am more likely to resonate with somebody who's white than I am with somebody who's brown skin, but like because of like I look like them, they look like me, I understand, there's some understood inherent similarity there. And the call of the believer is actually to rise above that nature or idea and realize that as people who are all created in the image of God, the thing that binds us together is what Christ did for us on the cross. And if that becomes your directive there, if that's kind of like your main marching orders, as it were, then that probably influences you more to lean towards the idea of maybe being lax on illegal immigration or figuring out ways to just help people and not just simply kind of saying like, well, you're here illegally, see you later, bud, or whatever that might, however that might present itself.
No, that's really good. That's really good, because part of the narrative of the gospel, particularly in the New Testament, is how the other, whatever other means, right? Not just ethnicity, but someone who's not in your tribe, quote unquote. That's the person who's actually your neighbor and who sits at the table. So that's really good. I really appreciate the way you worded that. Now, again, from the other perspective, right? And it was funny, I was just reading from an Old Testament scholar, and that's kind of my guild, where I spend most of my time and study is in the Old Testament. And a lot of posts that I've seen that are more pro-immigration are going to quote from the Old Testament. Hey, this is how you're supposed to treat your neighbor. This is how you're supposed to treat the foreigner. Well, I was reading this article the other day of a scholar who was actually kind of digging into some of the Hebrew and the literature in the Old Testament about this. And there's a distinction that he points out between someone who's more like a traveler, who's passing by.
Itinerant, right?
Yeah, and somebody who's actually trying to integrate into society. And he was pointing out how this distinction is actually significant in terms of being a prescription or an indicative for, oh, well, yeah, that just corresponds one-to-one to any society. And it's not that neat. Like, there's still borders in the Old Testament. There's still rules for society. And I think it's in Jeremiah when they're in exile. It says, hey, like, you need to pray for the welfare of where you're at.
Yeah, it's Jeremiah 29.
Yeah. And so that's kind of interesting there, right? How there's this directive to really take responsibility. And so as we move on to the second case, I think what we have here is, one, no matter what side you land on this, you're prioritizing in some way concentric circles of moral duty to a neighbor.
Yeah, I mean,
nobody's neutral on that.
No, you can't be. You can't be. There has to be. I mean, even when you read through different parts of like Nehemiah, right? Like when people are married to foreigners, they're still expected to kick their foreigner wives out or whatever it is. And so it's like there is some discussion or at least tension within the Hebrew Scriptures about like duty to the nation to which you belong there. And so it's messy, right? It's messy to say the least.
It really is. It really is.
So as we transition, we're looking, the second thing that we're going to discuss is the idea of shutting down churches, right?
Oh boy.
Yeah. So this is going to make everybody upset. So I'm hyped. So your religious rights, right? Like what are they? And does the government get to infringe? Particularly in America, here we have this thing called the First Amendment, which prohibits churches from being like infringed upon, you know, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of worship and things like that. But this is kind of a different wild card, right? Because a public health concern is a different ball game than just the tyrannical government coming and saying like, no, you're not allowed to go to church.
And we're specifically referencing
and so that's what we're talking about here.
Pandemic.
Coronavirus and its impact on the United States, both here and abroad, right, has clearly been nothing short of massive.
Right. And it came from like left field. We've never had something like this before.
Right. And so when we begin to discuss that, the idea that says for us, right, when we look at the value of staying closed down, right, not meeting in person, but still being able to meet together online or in other, you know, smaller, less than 10 groups, right, depending on where you are in the country, public health concerns are actually part of the mission of the church. And so this is one of the things I've seen from kind of the like, let's just follow what the government's asking us to do and not cause trouble, is the idea here is that one of the ways that we can love God and love our neighbor is by setting a good example. And when we do things that protect the most vulnerable against us, right, and especially when the book of James talks about taking care of widows, right, widows and orphans there. And so widows, we know, like, tend to be older, right, usually, unless something kind of rare happens, and elderly people are more susceptible to this idea. Like, we are in direct obedience with tenets of Scripture there, but also talking about setting a good example for people who might look for reasons to criticize the church. By us not meeting in person, we're not only taking away that ammunition, but we are actually saying, hey, look how much we care about the community, and our words match our actions, which then, you know, allows us to be able to fund this kind of project or help with this school thing, or, you know, do whatever there that we can save on. So when we concern ourselves with what our rights are, that's one kind of conversation, but it seems like the question that we should be asking with the church is, what are the inevitable problems that will arise, and how can we deal with them in a manner that mitigates risk and allows us to be able to be a part of the better shaping of public conversation, public policy discourse, and all of that.
No, I think so. That's right. From that perspective, you have, and this passage came to mind actually as you were speaking. In 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, Paul has this long discourse with the Corinthian church. And they're asking like, well, hey, like, don't we have the rights to eat meat, sacrifice to idols, which was like a particular situation where they were basically saying, hey, don't we have some equivalent First Amendment to do this? And Paul's like, yeah. But that's not the only question you should be asking.
Right.
Because if that's the only question you're asking, you might be missing a point.
Yeah.
And so from this perspective, that's exactly right. From that perspective, you're saying, hey, if you're only exclusively concerned with your rights, you're missing the point of the grander mission of the church, which is to care. You mentioned like vulnerable people of society, and a witness, a testimony to society. So that makes a ton of sense. Now,
so what's the counter here?
So from the other perspective, right, it's not only the rights of the church that I see as a concern, but I've read a lot, and even like anecdotally, a lot of people that I know in my circles are sharing this, how there's something different about meeting in person that you can't replicate
on Zoom.
There's something different about
for sure.
counseling, fellowship, just the simple physical touch of greeting, your brothers and sisters. And so one of the things that I've been hearing, and this is kind of interesting to me, is how mental health, and as it connects to spiritual health, and overall flourishing of people is being so incredibly drained by this whole pandemic as a whole, right? But now with specific reference to in-person meetings of churches, one of the things I'm hearing as an argument for the necessity and the essential nature of the church is people need this for their overall flourishing and health. And so here's the trade-off, right? It was kind of like the economics. There's only so much time that you can keep the economy shut down before you're doing more harm than good. Well, people are saying, well, keeping churches shut down is going to do more harm than good to a lot of people. Yeah, for sure. So how do you measure that, right? And so from that perspective, people are saying, hey, no, this is essential for a lot of people. Now, it's really interesting, actually, in our current context. Grace Community Church in Simi Valley, led by Pastor John MacArthur, they're actually in a kind of litigation.
Yeah, legal dispute.
A legal dispute.
Yeah, to put it nicely.
With the government right now over this issue. And so from their perspective, they claimed, to my understanding, two specific things. One is that due to the double standards or inconsistency of the government in what they deem essential and what they don't deem essential, that the credibility is no longer does no longer warrant obedience or submission from the church. Sure. So because the government has lost credibility, we no longer have to submit to them. That's the first thing I heard. The second thing is, it's an overreach of the government to impose those regulations on us. And so because it's an overreach, that also warrants our lack of submission to it. So that's really interesting because they're actually meeting in person and they're gonna fight the government over it. And so the question would then become, is that lawful? Is this a case where you should fight the government over? How would you determine that? What do you think?
Yeah, so this is where I spent some time looking for ways that we kind of moved out of an us versus them dichotomy with the government and moved into kind of a conversation where we could be meta government or trans government, just above the fray in its entirety. And I came across this example that I thought was really interesting that I wrote down here that talked about what was called the Challenge of Peace. And so this was a document that came out in 1983 that was a U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops pastoral letter on nuclear weapons, right?
Wow.
And so a bunch of them gathered together.
During the Cold War and stuff.
Yeah, during the Cold War with Reagan and the USSR, there was this real discussion about the nuclear deterrent, right, of the arms race and trying to amass more than the other guys so that way we could be ready to, kind of assure a mutually assured destruction between us and the USSR. And so they came together and they wrote this out, and this was a thing, it reaffirmed traditional Catholic teachings of a strong presumption against war while allowing, it when necessary and effectual for preserving a just peace, the idea of a just war theory, that preserved the fundamental human rights and dignity. And what I thought was interesting, though, is when they put this together and they submitted it for the government to take a look at, it wasn't a conversation that was necessarily we are going to do this, meet in person, for our example, because it's the right thing for us to do in terms of we have the right to do it. It was here's some Christian values and perspectives that we hold really dear, right? Here are some things that we think are really important. The right to life, the right to flourishing, not being nuclearly annihilated, right? These are good things for all of humanity. And the government listened to it, right? They interacted with it. The New York Times actually gave it a full spread in their paper. And I don't know if that's anything that would happen today. But the idea here was the church, instead of taking an oppositional defiance stance against the government, sought a way to be influential, right, and winsome, as it were, in the discussion of how can we actually make a difference that goes beyond the scope of can we come together Sunday morning for an hour or not, right? And not to downplay the importance of that there, but to say there's probably more at stake in the conversation here in terms of us being able to partner with where we're at. And so that was kind of my hope that we would see somebody kind of do, and there just hasn't really been much of that, right? There has been kind of this ensconced position of us versus them all the way through. And so a little bit unfortunate and a little bit frustrating, but I think kind of unavoidable in today's circumstances where everything is kind of climatized polarized in that way.
Yeah. No, that's right. That's really interesting too. And so ultimately what I see in this example of closing down churches, the the heavy lifting of wisdom and charity would be, at what point is giving up my rights too costly? Mm-hmm. At what point is giving up my rights actually for the better good? Mm-hmm. Or at what point, no, you actually have to stand up for yourself. Right. That's hard. That's messy.
Yeah.
And for good reason,
well,
right?
And do we need to stand up for ourselves as Christians? Like, is there even merit in asking that question? When we see the first examples of Jesus, the apostles, the first century Christians before Christianity married into Roman imperial rule, like, there wasn't a lot of defense of like, I got to stand up for X, Y, Z. It was just like, hey, look, man, I'm just going to kind of keep worshiping Jesus in a way that doesn't necessarily have to conflict with the government there. So
Yeah. No, that's good. So the third example that we have is rioting. Mm-hmm. So, man, I mean, since the killing of George Floyd, there has been not only a national but also global kind of movement, awareness, and manifestations, protests, to the end of calling attention to racial injustice, police brutality, and things like justice being carried out.
Sure.
Now, a lot of these manifestations have had examples or have also had riots along with them. Mm-hmm. And so with something like property destruction, looting, things like that, the question becomes then, in the grand scheme of things, is this lawful?
Right.
The question becomes, hey, where we clearly have established laws of not destroying people's property or not like theft, is how do we understand rioting from a Christian perspective with reference to the social situation of racial injustice? Yeah,
so the first thing that we do is we make the distinction between something being lawful and something being ethical, right? And so in the position that would kind of validate or maybe just accept, not necessarily validate, but be understanding of or charitable towards rioting, the idea is there's this valid manifestation between protests as peaceful kind of displays against injustice and rioting as violent manifestations of anger against injustice, right? Yeah. And so the distinction here highlights the depth of the disease, and really this is what we're talking about. When the line of thinking here is that if you care more about property than the fact that you do, people being killed or poor policing habits, whatever the kind of discussion is, then your priorities are misaligned, right? Because yes, nobody likes property damage. Nobody's like, hooray, pro mom and pop shop being burned to the ground or whatever. Yeah. People are pro, like, hooray, City Hall being burned to the ground, like targeted acts of violence and demonstration against governmental property.
That seems to be a separate issue, though.
Yeah, all right. I mean, whatever, that's cool. But it's like when you burn down somebody's mom and pop shop or whatever, right? That's a different story in its entirety.
You're doing some real harm to somebody's finances.
Who probably agrees with your cause, right? Or who probably is sympathetic to it. And so the question becomes, right, if you are so stuck in that part where you can't see the bigger issue at play, right? You're losing the forest for the trees, as it were. And so when you get so stuck on the idea that you can only see the discussion of like, man, you can't be burning down people's property, as opposed to like, hey, another unarmed person was just shot and murdered by the police, or whatever the idea is. The concept here is it's being hypocritical, right? That it's, until that discussion can see that bodies are more valuable than property, right? In the American case, particularly like black bodies and black people are more valuable than whatever shop, the idea becomes of destruction of property is both moot and hypocritical. And so, we kind of see this in the language of Malcolm X, early Malcolm X, right? Like by any means necessary, like when he was younger there, or even, Martin Luther King, who himself, not an advocate for property damage, still was one to make the distinction of saying rioting is the language of the unheard, right? And so these people...
Didn't he condemn rioting, though?
Yeah. So he would have said that rioting itself is not a good thing, right? That's why he was nonviolent in his protest there. But the idea that it still exists is something that we have to be aware of the larger picture of saying, until we deal with the issues at hand, these types of things are not going to stop there, because there's anger and there's nowhere else to channel it sometimes there. So
yeah, definitely. So one thing that I kind of heard as you were speaking is almost this dichotomy, right? Of, well, what's more important? Is it property or is it people? Mm-hmm. Now, this is what's really interesting to me. And most of my circles are pretty conservative. So I'm a lot, on my feed, on my posts, a lot of the people I talk to are saying, on the one hand, listen, we understand that there is racism out there and we don't want racism, we just don't think that two wrongs make a right. And so what's interesting to me is, so is there some validity to that in terms of, do we have to say, are they being hypocritical? Or no, that kind of makes sense.
Sure.
So from this perspective, right, from that perspective, there's a fundamental difference, not only in the forest and the trees, but in the nature of the acts.
Yeah, for sure.
Of peaceful protesting or civil disobedience, if that may be the case, as an American right, and the destruction of property as unlawful and therefore evil or sinful behavior.
Sure.
I remember having this one conversation with a friend, and the way that he broke this down, as we were talking and discussing this, is if we are willing to grant or to concede even something like, this is just the symptom, we should be concerned with the disease. Yeah. He said, well, if that's the perspective you want to take, then you have to grant at some level that it's sometimes okay, or that it's sometimes not evil, or that it's sometimes righteous anger. And he's saying, if you do that, well, how are you logically consistent then? So that's interesting, because what seems to be the concern then from this perspective is the consistency, or like the logical clarity of saying, no, if something is bad, it's bad all the time, no matter the circumstance. So it's never okay to burn down a car, somebody else's car. Yeah. Right? So that's interesting, because you could make a case for those two things from a biblical standpoint, I suppose. And another thing I really see too is people, posting memes or saying, well, MLK condemned riots. And so these people are taking MLK's name and they're distorting his message by going out there and rioting. And man, what's really crazy is everybody's like an expert in MLK now. Sure. And interpreting him and understanding him. And so it just kind of hits home how tragic it is that, we don't have him to speak for himself at this point, right? Sure. But those are the two perspectives on that. And so as we kind of head to some conclusions here, what I really find to be at the fundamental logical level of these conversations is, what's more valuable? Is it the Christian way of doing things in reference to the government, or is it getting Christian things done?
Yeah. So on that one hand, right, if getting society to look more Christian is preferred, then using the government as kind of a blunt object, right, to implement whatever Christian values are for you, then we have to commit to electing those officials to make that a thing, right? We have to get people to overturn Roe v. Wade or defund Planned Parenthood or bring prayer back to schools, et cetera. But if it's the other way, then it's a different conversation entirely.
Correct. So like you said, if on the one hand, just getting Christian things done, if looking society to look more Christian is the end goal with reference to government, well, then you can bite the bullet and vote for somebody who isn't a Christian, or vote for somebody that maybe you don't agree with on certain things, because he's going to get Christian things done. Sure. Right? On the other hand, however, though, if the end goal or the reference, the orientation of the church's relationship to government isn't just to get Christian things done, but to live in a Christian way, then you have a difference. And this is what I find fascinating. There's a theologian by the name of Cornelius Van Til, right? Super intense name. I want you guys to look him up. Dutch theologian in the 20th century. He wrote in the 1900s. And he came from this perspective. He said, listen, the end goal isn't just to make society Christian. It's for the new society of God, which is the church, to live in such a way and to model Christianity in such a way where it's winsome, where we're less concerned with wielding the club of government to get things done than showing why Christianity is preferred over other views, and how actually everybody flourishes if society, if the church wanted the benefit of all. Now, granted, that gets real tricky, right? Because at some point you have to stand up and say, like, no, we shouldn't approve of some things. But part of this messiness is where we need a little deeper thinking about it. With grace, with charity, with love of neighbor. But these are people who really love Jesus, but really disagree on these things.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Now, what do you guys think? Whichever view you think is preferable probably says a lot about your political philosophy. So we want to challenge you. Dig deeper into that. Really own your convictions. Shoot us some questions down below and let us know what you think. We'll see you next time.
Have a good one.